Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nicholas Adams, and I'm a professor in philosophical theology here in the university. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening on behalf of the University of Birmingham and the School of Philosophy, Theology and Religion to the 2016 Cadbury Lectures. This lecture series has been in train for over 50 years. And as you can see this evening, it goes from strength to strength with each passing year. You're very warmly welcome here this evening. It is one of the strange quirks of university life that those who welcome you and present lectures are rarely the ones who have done all the work. So I would particularly like to start by paying tribute to Tamsin Cross, who has been the main linchpin and organizer for these lectures. Tamsin, we're very much in your debt. Thank you very much for gathering us this evening for these lectures. Our lecturer for these 4 Cadbury lectures this week and next is Professor Grace Davey, Emeritus Professor in the Sociology of Religion from the University of Exeter. She has had an extraordinary influence not just in the sociology of religion but in public life more generally. She has been a senior advisor to the Impact of Religion Research Program at Uppsala University. She is a past president of the American Association for the Sociology of Religion, and she is on the Research Committee 22, the Sociology of Religion of the International Sociological Association up until 2006. Professor Davey's many honors extend through her whole career, starting from her early work in France and then in Britain. In 2000, Professor Davey was the Kerstin Hesselgren Professor at Uppsala, and she has returned there for subsequent visits, extending a research project over some 6 years, and received an honorary degree there in 2008. But she has also held visiting appointments which very clearly indicate the European focus of her intellectual interests in Paris at the École pratique des hautes études and the École des hautes études en sciences sociales in recent years. It would take us our entire time for me to go through the list of publications of Professor Davey, so I will restrict myself to the monographs for which she is best known. Religion in Britain since 1945, Religion in Modern Europe, Europe, the Exceptional Case, a major work, The Sociology of Religion, and Religion in Britain, a Persistent Paradox, which will take us slightly closer, I suspect, to the content of this evening's lectures and those which follow. Now that's a sort of broad outline of the publications and honours which Professor Davey has had, but there is more to say, and slightly more important things to say. After the Second World War, sociologists began to discover that they were not simply publishing in journals and addressing each other in expert discourses. Sociologists shape our imaginations. They give us the categories in which we deal. They provide the frameworks for our very sense-making as we make our way in our ordinary lives. And this is true of none more than Professor Grace Davey. So if you ever find yourself using such expressions as believing without belonging, or belonging without believing, Professor Davey is a dialectical thinker. These are terms which Professor Davey introduced into the popular imagination over a life's work. So believing without belonging, trying to do justice to the ways in which many folk have quite strong and defined theological commitments without having institutional affiliations necessarily, or conversely, belonging without believing, a strong sense in which religious institutions structure public life and enable all kinds of folk who are not necessarily lifelong members of those institutions to benefit from them and to participate in them. Belonging without believing. And these kinds of dialectical interest will, I suspect, structure our interests. The 4 lectures we have before us today, Religion in Public Life, Levelling the Ground, will, as you can see from the very titles, deal in ascending orders of scale, starting from the local and moving through to the global. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce to you one of the leading intellectual figures who has changed the way we think about religion, not just in Britain and not just in Europe, but the very phenomenon of religion itself. Please join me in welcoming Professor Grace Davey.
Thank you for that extraordinarily generous welcome. Thank you to Tamsin for making the practicalities so easy, and thank you to all for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here and to think with you about ideas that were in my mind but needed further formulation, and a series of lectures is the ideal opportunity to turn, as it were, something rather implicit into something rather more concrete. This evening I'm going to do just a very short introduction to all 4 lectures, and then we're going to plunge into the local, and then next week, on Thursday, we'll pick up on the second lecture straight away. So forgive me if we just sort of lay the ground a little bit so that we know where we're going. Here are the 2 books. Religion in Britain since 1945, which Nicholas very kindly talked about. You see the subtitle, Believing Without Belonging, published in 1994. And then my invitation to do a second edition, or the invitation to me to do a second edition, which took rather a long time, put it that way. And in the end is effectively a new book, though it's a book in which I talk to myself. Those are the framing books, if you like, for what we're doing this evening. And in between the 2, religion had shifted. In the seminars that I'm going to do with the students, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the shifts between the 2. But one of the things that a lot of people now declare is to say that religion has returned to public life. And to a degree, I would agree with them. Like most commonplaces, it is partially true. It is true that religion is present in public life in this country in new and very visible ways, which I will explain. But we need to be cautious, because to imply that religion was once nowhere and is now everywhere is seriously misleading. So there's a good deal of continuity that we need to deal with. But what I want to do is to bring to your attention some very different push and pull factors that account for this rather paradoxical situation. Now, we could do a whole series of lectures on this. I've lectured many times on these factors, but we're going to really do a speeded up version. We need to recognize that whatever happens in this country in terms of religious life, our cultural heritage is firmly Christian. Simply to deny that is a category mistake. And if you want proof, just think of time and space. Think of weeks, weekends, holidays, festivals, etc., and you can see that our society is patterned on Christian time. It's just a fact. You can just look out of the window in any European city, and you will see a Christian skyline. You might find in a city like this one that it's modifying in places, but you do need to be careful where you put a building of another faith community. In the centre of Oxford is not a good idea. That's our background. And then vicarious religion, which is really belonging without believing. It's the notion of the institution sustaining ideas and practices on behalf of a larger number, framing, as it were, aspects of our lives. This is the old model. And to use an economic analogy, and if you do use analogies, they're fine, but never go too far, never push too hard. But the easiest way to grasp this is as a public utility. It is a territorial system from the national level to the diocesan or regional level to the parish being the building block of European society. And it's there at the point of need for anyone who wishes to avail themselves of it, like the National Health Service, and in similar trouble, because public utilities are terribly expensive, and even more so if your funding base is becoming more and more restricted. And as it were, the diminution of this public utility is the story of secularization, and it is continuing. But over the top of that public utility grows a market in religion. And we're going to consider both sides of this equation. Mostly today, I should be talking about the strain on the old model. On Thursday, when we talk about London, I shall be describing to you an incredible market in religion. And so you're going to see both sides of this coin. We also need to consider new arrivals. No account of religion in this country is complete unless you include people who are arriving mostly for economic reasons, but bringing with them new ways of being religious. And that's part of our current scene. And some rather sharp secular reactions. The more religion pushes into the public sphere, the sharper the reaction. And so as religion becomes ascendant in the public sphere, the secular reactions are, as it were, heightened. And I do think that is a reaction. And we need to remind ourselves that what we see around us in Britain or Europe is not a global prototype. It is not the case that what Europe does today, everybody else will do tomorrow. The Europeans don't always grasp that, that's for sure. But by and large, the world, as opposed to Europe, is as furiously religious as ever, using Peter Berger's language. And the world, moreover, is arriving in Britain. And so what we have, effectively, is a paradox. The process of secularization continues. It does not turn round. And yet, we talk more about religion. Religion is more present in debate than it was 20 years ago when I wrote the first book. And yet we are, at the same time, becoming more, not less, secular. And it's that paradox that we need to get our minds around. Think of it like two tectonic plates. One is the European plate, which is moving steadily towards secularization. The glacier is not turning around. But the global plate, which is a minority plate in this country, but much bigger overall, is encroaching. And when two tectonic plates meet, they grate. And that's why the debate is sharp and difficult at times. Made worse by the fact that at precisely the moment when we need to talk well about religion, we are losing the vocabulary, tools, and concepts that we require to have a constructive conversation about faith. This is inevitable because we're becoming more secular. And so what is the consequence? The consequence, regrettably, is an ill-informed and ill-mannered debate about issues of extreme importance to the democratic future of this country. I'm afraid it's rather depressing. And if I had any passion about what I was doing, it would be to, as it were, that's really why I wrote the second book, was to improve the situation regarding what I call, not only me, but what several scholars call religious literacy. We need to relearn how to talk well about faith, which is a different thing from being a member of a church or, as it were, assenting to a faith. It's simply to have enough knowledge and enough sensitivity, enough vocabulary, enough imagination to talk well about issues which really do impinge on the democratic future of our country. Now, there's various ways of doing this. Adam Dinham, you might know, who a colleague of mine, has done a lot of work in this field, and he has, as it were, divided the field into different sectors: welfare, social work, education, the media, the law. You can go on and think of foreign policy, you can go and you can think of international relations and that kind of thing, but you don't need the same vocabulary for all of them. the kind of vocabulary you need to offer sensitive care to somebody in a hospital whose life is nearing the end, and you need to know what to do if they come from a faith community with which you are not familiar, is not the same kind of knowledge that you need to navigate in the current Middle East in all its explosive issues. And we need to skill ourselves appropriately and think what we're doing. You can also do this in terms of disciplines. Theology and religious studies has a vocabulary which is rather different from the social sciences. Policy studies are different again. I read a very interesting PhD quite recently, and it was a very poignant remark made in it. It's somebody who was in fact working in the Foreign Office and had come out to do a PhD, and a lot of it was about religious literacy and how policymakers find it difficult to talk about religion, and a lot of reluctance to talk about religion and how to engage difficult issues. But she remarked, and I thought very fairly, that academics, including people like me, are not policy literate. That in fact we don't talk well to policymakers. If you're talking in the public domain and in public engagement, you need to talk very differently from the academic seminar. And if you mix up the two, you can get into trouble. I thought I must remember that. You know, I keep on saying policymakers are not religiously literate, but she did bring to my attention, maybe we need to pay attention as well. And as Nick said, I sort of had to begin somewhere. So I decided that this phrase, levelling the ground, a sort of play on words, because what I'm really doing is picking the levels apart, was a kind of innovative way to do this. Because we're working up from the local to the global, and I think you've probably seen the titles. Today we're going to think locally. On Thursday, I beg your pardon, we're going to look at the metropolis, about London. I'm very curious to see where you, as people of Birmingham, situate yourselves. Whether you see yourself like London in this respect, or whether you retain a distinctiveness of your own city. I'm really very curious to see how you react to that. We will then look at national debates, and the two that I'm going to take are the one that started with Faith in the City and the one that started with the publication of the Satanic Verses. And both of them set hairs chasing, which are still running. The basic issues beneath them are unresolved. And the question I ask is, when the church intervenes in public debate, whose feathers are ruffled? Who, as it were, gets uncomfortable when they hear churches intervene in different kinds of conversations? And then in the last lecture, it's a slightly different approach. It's happening, I'm doing it because that piece of work is concurrent with these lectures. And I have been asked to work on a big team, I won't do much more of the detail now, that is concerned with social science and social progress. And one of the things that has come out of that very forcibly to me is, in the social science community, if they admit religion to exist at all, that's step one, they assume that it impedes social progress. And so it's really trying to find a vocabulary and find a discourse which gives, as it were, an adequate, reflective account of religion, and yet speaks to individuals or communities, disciplines, who would rather not take this seriously. So religious literacy is my subtext, if you like, or right through the lectures. I would like to acknowledge my debt to Adam Dinham and his Religious Literacy Leadership Project. If you want these websites, I will of course leave the slides behind so that you can pick up all the details that you so wish. I really admire his work, which is extending in various ways. In a way, I shall be isolating particular bits of the discourse or particular bits of literacy in each lecture, but life being what it is, It is, of course, more messy than this, and these are very unlikely to be one-on-one relationships. But that's, as it were, my plan. Whether we achieve it, and time will tell. But that's where I'm headed. And now we think locally. Now, there was an issue here that had to be addressed pretty quickly. Local to whom? Because we all live locally, if you like. Well, I decided that the prerogative of the lecture was to choose the locality. So the local is my local. I was reminded of a rather silly joke that I heard years ago about some chap who read that most accidents happen within 3 miles of home. And so they all were he in those days, moved. And I don't want, I did want to choose Exeter and the Southwest because somewhere in this frame I wanted some attention to rural issues. Because so often we get preoccupied with the urban, and I thought, that's one thing I can bring to Birmingham, as it were. So I'm focused in Exeter, but you will see very soon that I have also done locality studies right across Europe. So the notion of local, of course, can be done anywhere. And I will tell you about a project, one of the Uppsala projects that I was involved in. That was a locality-based project, and it throws up some very interesting things. Now, if you look at Exeter's, or if you like, Devon's, churches, religious organisations, the buildings, the plant, the personnel, the leadership, volunteers, networks, local knowledge, social capital, you discover an incredible world. I mean, it is extraordinary what goes on. Exeter's got about 110,000, 120,000 people, but you can find it in a town of 30,000 as well, all over Devon. It is still, even in these moderately secular days, absolutely extraordinary, I think, what the faith communities sustain between them. A lot of it's under the radar. And it is a story of continuity. It simply isn't the case that 20 years ago they were doing nothing and now they're doing loads. This is a story of dogged perseverance. It just goes on. But the initiatives, you see there's a sort of mutation, often in the presenting issues. The underlying, as it were, care or aspiration to care for the neighbour or care for the community, I think is pretty constant. But its presenting issues do change. And in order to get an idea of this, I'm going to introduce you to a great friend of mine, Martin Goss, who is, his current title, I think he's had several, the Director of Church and Society in the Exeter Diocese. And he's been in post since 1983. That's it's more than 30 years, isn't it? And I went and talked to Martin after Christmas because I knew I was doing these lectures. And Martin said, I'll give you a list of all the things I do. I thought, crumbs. And the list came, and it has over 330 entries. I'm not going to read them all to you. You'll be glad to know. I'm going to read about 10 from the first page and about 10 from the last page. So we're in 1983, and Martin is sustaining, talk about spinning plates. He's remarkable in what he keeps going. And the kind of thing he was involved in the 80s were Devon Church's support for South Africa, Christian care training, hospices in Devon, Tiverton Volunteer Centre, Exeter Conciliation Service, Devon Christian Ecology Group, and several ecology groups, even in the 1980s, Street Hostel, Palace Gate Project, which is a homeless project, the Sissindwell Centre, which does all kinds of things, Flame, which is the marriage guidance or the care for or attention to marriage and the quality of marriage, And then there's rural ministry, race relations, community initiatives, and so on and so on. And if you look in 2016, you find some of it is really very similar. Housing justice. The Global Centre for Work, there's now a lot of attention to finding work, that kind of thing. Interfaith is now much more on the agenda, even in the Southwest. Eco-Church Southwest, Carbon Fast, Climate Lobby of Parliament, Devon Solidarity Pilgrimage, Devon Earth and Faith Network, Dementia Workshops, Living Wage Debate and Implementation, Disability, School Holiday Cookery Club, and Faith Speakers Project. And some of those I will flesh out, not many of them because I can't do them all. And what I also learned from Martin is that his work is astonishingly broad in scope, but it is distinctive. It reflects his commitments and interests. And if you tracked his post in different dioceses, you would find different profiles. For example, people who come into that job out of the police are much more involved in things like criminal justice. There's all the prison things, and they vary a little depending on who's doing the role. But it is, if you read right through it, a running commentary on the churches and social action, social responsibility in Devon and the Southwests. And currently, you will find what we all talk about now, credit unions, food banks, job clubs, eco-groups, but they too evolve over time. And so there's now much less stress on, as it were, providing food, and a lot more about educating about food, and holiday clubs where children go to the allotment, find the, dig up the food they're going to as it were, work with, and then they're shown how to cook it, and then they take dinner home and that kind of thing. So it's a much more educational process. I mean, quite astonishing. And it is just under the radar, continuing, no big deal, but there. And I think we would do well to pay attention. Of course, every now and again, somebody does one of these computational exercises of how much would this cost the local authority if they did it. And the sums are appreciable. The maths is rather difficult, of course. But if we now put this into a European perspective, and the project I'm thinking of is Welfare and Religion in a European Perspective, which we did in the early 2000s. Again, you can look it all up if you want to. And the first project we did had 8 national cases in Europe. The follow-up one has a slightly different title, had 12 countries. But the point was that each of the studies was done in a town roughly the size of Exeter. In fact, the English one was Darlington. It wasn't Exeter. But there are, as it were, equivalents all over Europe. And this is a very interesting exercise because you see across Europe, this is where you begin to see commonality in Europe, that smallish towns operate in similar ways. They are more similar to each other than national governments are to each other. I mean, in France, it's very well known that there's an extremely sharp standoff between the Catholic Church and the secular state. And so much so that the research in the French case was quite difficult because you're not supposed to research religion because it's not supposed to be there. But if you dig under the, underneath and really look in the locality about what is happening, an awful lot is happening because the churches, as semi-proscribed institution, take care of the sans-papiers and the people who are not supposed to be there. And quite a lot of it is done by the religious orders that still survive, but in the religious orders, they're not French people. They're very likely to come from West Africa. And so you see a whole new set of variables simply because you're working at a different level. So national and local need to be, as it were, kept together in this respect. And we found right across Europe some very common themes like, is there a tension between becoming a provider, particularly if you state money? Do you forfeit your right to prophecy, as it were, to the prophetic voice? Are you able to criticize the government if you are, as it were, taking government money to provide? And that's an issue that always comes up in this field. Should the church do the government's work? Should the church, as it were, take public money? And does it, as it were, neutralize its capacity to criticize? I just tell you a little bit about the Norwegian example. This is, as it was, I think the nearest equivalent would be a church army officer. The names are slightly different in Norway. And this individual, a very impressive man, and a small team, was responsible for the people in the community who were suffering or taken up with substance abuse. And obviously caring very deeply for these people in Drammen, which is a town outside Oslo, but at the same time really laying into the local authority and the government for their treatment of such people in the local press. And in that particular situation was a wonderful example of as it were, putting your money where your mouth is. People listened to him because they knew that he did the work, as well as it were, telling the government that the treatment of such people was unacceptable in a society like Norway. The other thing we find right across Europe, absolutely from Finland to Greece, it was before the current crisis in Greece, but I don't think this has changed at all, is the gendered nature of care. If you put the churches and the welfare state side by side, in both cases, the delivery is very largely in the hands of women, and the management is very largely in the hands of men. And nobody seems to have noticed. And, you know, they're very, very close parallels. And if you say to European people, have you noticed this, or would you remark on the fact that most of the caring is done by women, the response is absolutely immediate, right across Europe. Of course it is. They're much better at it. It's a very unquestioning acceptance of the role of women, a woman as the caregiver. And it comes out in very interesting ways, because if you look at the Nordic countries, for example, in childcare, which is nearly always delivered institutionally, enviably, if any of you are thinking of working and bringing up children, the Swedish Nordic answers are enviable. But the care is low paid and it's almost all done by women. If you go to Greece or Italy, Greece is obviously a troubled case now, you will still find it delivered by women. In the family, they don't lose their family model, which is extremely important to them, but the caregiver will be a migrant, a Filipino, or somebody coming in from Albania into Italy, or Romania. But it's still a woman, and she's then sending the money home for her own family, and the chain goes internationally. And I've just read an extremely interesting thesis on food banks in Finland. Sometimes we think Finland is so wealthy that they don't need food banks. They do. They had a very sharp recession in the 90s when they lost the Russian market, and they never really recovered till 2008. And there's a very interesting spin on this thesis, because in a way, the author argues that the giving of surplus food legitimates overproduction. So in a way, it's as it were, you should see it within the context of affluence just as much as in the context of poverty. I've enjoyed hugely my time in Scandinavia, but often working, as it were, in a local context, and also listening to the various researchers who were doing this work all over Europe. Another issue that came up, which I think is a very interesting one in this respect, is volunteering. I feel, as I've lived through all of this, who are the volunteers? Well, it was married women before they decided they would work. And if you looked at volunteering probably in the 60s, you would find enormous numbers of married women who sometimes the children were still small or they had little time and they contributed hugely to local economy and local care. Then it turned into the early retired. We don't have so many early retired now because early retirement doesn't happen anymore. And that's a whole set of issues, but I mean, go and look at your CAB networks and that kind of thing, and you find a lot of people who stopped work at 55 and have done 10, 15 years of incredible work in that kind of context. Now, it's young professionals. Because it's now a good thing to have on your CV that you have contributed and helped. It doesn't mean you were only doing it because you couldn't get a job. It means you're a can-do, want-to-contribute person, and you get it into your CV, and lots of universities permit, as it were, the voluntary sector to develop amongst students. And what I think is very interesting is to look at the recruitment sort of processes that go on. And I'm taking street pastors as an example, which is a very interesting example. I mean, there is, something like 13,000, probably more than that now, street pastors in this country. I mean, it's just enormous. And there's a lovely study of them. In fact, it's not in Exeter, though we do have street pastors there. This study was done in Kingston. And you find the recruitment goes disproportionately through churches. And this is Robin Gill's work. It's not new. It's 1990s on moral communities. Churches provide an ethic of care. They teach an ethic of care. And at the same time, they give you a network of opportunity. Because you don't become a street pastor or a prison visitor or anything else because you wake up one morning and think that's what you're going to do. You do it because you know somebody who does it. You have friends who do it. And the friend says, there's a training day on Saturday, why don't you come with me? You'd be great. And it goes through the networks, and you can, sociologically, this is not hard to substantiate. This happens in food banks. This is how people recruit to food banks. This is how people recruit to all the things that are now currently very much part of our vocabulary in this respect. But the younger volunteers, it's quite different. If you're stuck and you want, help, you put it on social media. And, you put it on Facebook, and you get 4 or 5 people come and help you that particular evening. Now, that's bypassing the churches altogether. And those young people are probably not in churches anyway. And I think this might make a considerable difference. We'll see. On the question of volunteers, I think the most interesting question to ask, and again this came out right across Europe, was what do volunteers do well? Well, what they are really excellent at is one-on-one care. All the support and befriending of elderly, of people who, because of mental impairment, need help, or people who are simply lonely or for whom life has been particularly difficult. And this, of course, is labour intensive. So if it's paid, it's very, very expensive. And yet volunteers can make a huge contribution in this way. And you'd find it all over the place, and you find it in Exeter. And it does still run through the churches. This is, again, how you recruit them. It may be changing, but I think it's too soon to say. What volunteers do less well, of course, is if they are overburdened with the administration. Because if you load them too high, they simply collapse. They can't do it. And I think it's very interesting to note as well that if you run anything like street pastors or whatever it is, it's now much, much more difficult to do it because you're always looking over your shoulder at the new legislation. And I don't want to go into that now, but I mean, that's a real challenge in this area. Not lack of willingness, but simply the red tape, the hoops that you have to jump through. thinking locally made me think of the media. Now, the national media, and we'll see that a little bit on Thursday, is not that kind to religion. That's the ill-mannered and ill-informed debate, and we see lots of it. If you want a study of it, look at this book, Media Portrayals of Religion, edited by Kim Knott. And what she tells us, which is very interesting, is that in the 20 years that I was interested in, coverage of religion in the media has risen. There's a lot more of it. That's not a sign of secularization. But it is very largely negative. And it is particularly negative in relation to Islam. This is ill-mannered and it is ill-informed and it's not helpful. But I do think it's worth noting that at local level, the media are much, much more positive. And the reason is that they know you. And I'm just going to give you one example. It's quite an interesting one from Exeter because it's not what you think of in terms of Exeter. It's from the Express and Echo, which is only now published once a week, but you can find it online. And this local Sikh community is in Plymouth. This particularly, there's a very well-known Sikh family in Plymouth who has made a big impression in that city. And this is a nice example of the local Sikh community providing food for Exeter's homeless. You can look it up if you want to. It's quite recent. And the coverage in the media is totally positive. You know, this is a good thing to do. We're really pleased to report this. And we affirm what is going on. A couple of other things made me feel good about the locality. Also in Plymouth is an initiative called Devon Faith and Belief Forum. This happens in Plymouth, and anybody who wants to, as it were, consider often going into schools to talk about their faith are invited to this group in order to be trained. Can you listen and reflect before speaking with confidence and convey your faith and belief to those who seek greater understanding? And you can go to this group and you can have 3 sessions or whatever it is. And this is very effective training in religious literacy and often filtered back through the schools through RE lessons. That to me is totally positive. And in this respect, one of my kind of basic tests, challenges that I often suggest to people, you know, in terms of religious literacy. One is the local phone-in. Could you pick up your phone and contribute with confidence in a local debate about religion in your community? Have you got the courage? Have you got the equipment in terms of knowledge? And have you got, as it were, the sensitivity to do this well? You don't have to write to the Times. You just start with a local phone-in. And my other test is the taxi driver one. Now, I'm just jumping ahead a wee bit to London, but if you get into a black cab in London and you say, well, if you're unwise enough, if he says, what are you doing? Or I'm saying, will you take me to so-and-so? What are you going to do when you get there? And I say, I'm going to do a lecture on religion. Well, you know what will happen next, you know. It won't be a pleasant discourse on the evils of religion and immigration and all the rest of it. And you're pretty sure to get it. But if I'm courageous enough to use my Uber app, which is a bit of a challenge, my taxi driver, of course, will be an immigrant. The discourse will be entirely different because they will be telling me about their country and why they came here. And it will be an entirely different sort of set of issues that arise. And I think that's quite a nice comparison in London of different kinds of people driving different kinds of taxis. And if you like, the market, once again, is taking over. Here's another thing that I'm very proud of, and I'm proud of this because I, amongst other things, chair the St Luke's Foundation in Exeter. It's not a huge thing, but we have enough money to, as it were, fund some projects, and this is one of our projects. And it is a wonderful encourager of good RE. And I am absolutely astonished with what these, simply building these hubs and giving RE teachers the chance to talk to each other and to engage in research projects and disseminate best practice and create partnerships is simply what they have achieved. I mean, this is a classic case of relatively little money going a long way if you use it carefully. And this is now getting national attention, it's growing, it's creeping up the peninsula. Maybe we'll get to Birmingham, it would be great if it did. It's a very, very interesting, I've met one or two of them, and I am just blown away by what a young child can absorb if they are really well taught. And what the potential of RE is in building religious literacy. I mean, regrettably, the government does not lead from the front on this. Well, they do lead, but they lead in several different directions, which is not helpful. But if we could get a much more coherent policy, here is where some of the repair work can be done. RE can be superb. Regrettably, it's too often underfunded and sidelined, and these very gifted teachers cannot deliver to their potential. Here is a place where we can do better. This is less reassuring. When I first went to Exeter in the late 80s, this was published. I do apologize. I find it very interesting because of its language. Look at the date, and the starting point, of course, was the Southwest. It still does this to an extent, congratulating itself that it is not diverse. And to be diverse is not a good thing. You hear it repeatedly. You can hear it by taxi drivers in Exeter, but our taxi drivers, we now have at least 15 or 16 Afghans. If I go home late on, in the evening, take a taxi home, it's often an Afghan that takes me. The interesting thing is in 1992, and you'll see this when I get to next week's lectures, the discourse is about racism. It's not about religion. That's one of the things that has switched in the last 15, 20 years, is that the discourse has moved to talk about religion and much less about ethnicity and racism. And the consequences are very interesting in terms of whose feathers are ruffled, which I'll tell you next week. And particularly the social sciences are much, much more comfortable with ethnicity and racism than they are with religion. The vocabulary has changed, and now in Exeter, we do realize that we cannot be isolated from the rest of the country, though some people try quite hard to do that. And the current migrant crisis is affecting us all, and this was a lot more encouraging. I don't know so much about it, but I was very pleased to find it. Martin Goss told me to look it up, and I did, and it's got quite a lot of support in the university, with Exeter becoming a city of sanctuary. And so, even in the southwest, we're doing a bit better, put it that way. But I want now, because we're getting to the end of time, to, as it were, wrap this in a theoretical postscript, because this, as it were, concludes what I'm doing today, but also gives me my takeoff point for Thursday. And it concerns the relative fortunes of rural and urban churches. Now, in 1994, when I've published the first book, the rural church was doing relatively well. And we were not long out of faith in the city, and the hard, stony ground, if you like, were urban priority areas. This was where it was tough to be in ministry or whatever you were doing. It echoes two very traditional approaches to secularization. The rural church is the pre-modern society. The parish, the territory, is how it was before industrialization and urbanization. And the story has it, of course, that as Britain or anywhere in Europe secularized and urbanized, it necessarily, as it urbanized and industrialized, I beg your pardon, it necessarily secularized. Modernization brings with it secularization. That is the classic statement of secularization thesis. It is, however, a Eurocentric view. Christendom, which we experience, is a territorially based public utility. And it's that that's threatened, not Christianity as such. Take a look around the globe, and you will discover that there is no necessary incompatibility between religion and urban living. The largest churches are in the largest cities. So Europe is secular, relatively, not because it is modern, but because it is European. And that begins to pull the whole secularization thesis and set of assumptions apart. So this is how we move from one book to the other. And what we find in the data is a marked reversal in the relative fortunes of the rural and urban churches in Britain. It is the old public utility, parish-based, rural model that is under strain. It's very, very difficult to sustain it. If you are responsible for 5, 6, 8, 10 churches, you're going to be working very hard. The strain on the parish system is immense, and the public utility, universal provision, is cracking. This is the crisis of the Church of England. But it's not simply an Anglican question. I give you one example from the Catholic world. I'm sorry. Portraits du Catholicisme. Two authors, they're rather difficult names, so we'll leave them. Shows you how this has been happening right across the Catholic world. Think of Italy, Portugal, Spain, France, Belgium. And what you find is, because of historical factors and relative wealth, that in Italy and Portugal it's hardly changed. In France and Belgium it is highly secular, and it's collapsed even more than the Church of England. And Spain is sliding very fast from one to the other. This is not simply an Anglican question. So my question is, what can and cannot be sustained? Sustainability is a buzzword applied to the churches, in my case. And I think the question to ask, which is absolutely central to the Church of England now, is what is good and positive about the old model, and what is simply a burden. Now, just to pick up the question of volunteers again. They're wonderful, and they sustain enormous numbers of churches. Without them, we'd be lost. But does this provide a solution, or does it simply perpetuate the problem? I think that's a real question. I think this is what the Church of England wrestles with now, and I don't like the notion that it's either, as it were, the success model against the old model. I really do not like that dichotomy. I think it's a false one. I think what we have to work out is what is good, wholesome, beneficial, and, as it were, sustainable in the old model and build onto it, and then to think how, in new ways of thinking, we can, as it were, move towards a rather different way of doing things, which might look, in some cases, rather more like a market. I should do the next bit, the market bit, next time. We need all of us to discern the futures. One option you probably heard of is this notion of festival churches, that the community cares for the church rather than the worshipping community, the village community. But the question is how to continue the presence, ensure continuing presence in the public life of communities as well as in the private life of individuals, inheriting, as it were, a system that was infinitely larger and from a different kind of life, but without discarding the really positive deposits of our history and as it were, using them as the springboard for future development. And my voice is collapsing now, so it's time that I stop. Thank you all for your attention, and we'll carry on next Thursday. But before that, we do some questions.